All right, let's jump right into it today. We're going deep on U.S.-China trade relations. We've got a whole mix of stuff to work with here. Some historical overviews, some recent economic analysis. It's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, buckle up. This one's a long and winding road.
Oh, I'm all about it. You know I love a good origin story.
I do.
And get this. One of our sources mentions that the very first American ship to trade with China set sail way back in 1784. 1784. Can you believe it?
That is going way back, before the country was even really established.
Seriously. The Empress of China, they called her? Talk about a name that sets the bar high, huh? Apparently, it was loaded up with ginseng and a bunch of other goods. It's kind of wild to think that was like the spark that lit this whole relationship that shaped, well, basically the entire global economy.
It really is striking when you think about it. I mean, it wasn't just about the stuff they were trading, right? This was the U.S. showing up on the world stage, wanting a piece of that lucrative Chinese market.
China was pretty much closed off to the West back then, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. So for the U.S., that voyage of the Empress of China, it was like a signal, a whole new era of possibility.
Huge. Definitely not just some random trade deal. This was the beginning of something big.
Raw.
Speaking of big, we've got some info here about the Opium Wars. And while the U.S. didn't actually fight in them, our sources make it pretty clear there were some serious ripple effects.
Oh, yeah. Huge ripple effects. This is the mid-1800s, remember? Britain and China going head-to-head. And those British victories, well, they led to some pretty unequal treaties.
Unequal how?
Well, China had to open up more ports, and they had to give foreigners these extraterritorial rights. Basically, it meant foreigners weren't bound by Chinese laws. It's a messy period, no doubt, but crucial for understanding the whole power dynamic that shaped trade for, like, a century after.
So even though the U.S. was sitting on the sidelines, they kind of won?
In a roundabout way, yeah. There's this treaty, the Treaty of Wanghia, signed in 1844 between the U.S. and China. Basically, it gave American merchants the same perks the British had just strong-armed out of China.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time. I mean, not so great for China, obviously, but for the U.S., their foothold in China was solidified, trade just explodes.
Definitely a classic example of global events having unintended consequences, even for the folks who weren't directly involved.
Absolutely. Okay, let's fast forward a bit. World War II. The whole world slipped on its head, and now the U.S. and China are buddies, fighting side by side against Japan.
Big shift in alliances there, and the U.S. really stepped up to help, sending money, weapons, even those legendary flying tigers.
Those guys were incredible.
Yeah.
Total badasses in the air.
Yeah.
Their support was huge for the Chinese.
Oh, absolutely. The flying tigers became a real symbol of the U.S.-China alliance, you know? Proof that they could work together, share a common goal. Problem is, after the war ended, things got complicated again.
Wartime alliances don't always last, do they?
Yeah.
So what happened? What shifted the dynamic?
Well, China had its own internal conflict to deal with. The Civil War, communists versus nationalists. And in 1949, the communists won, established the People's Republic of China. And, well, that created a whole new set of problems with the U.S.
Capitalism versus communism, right?
Yeah.
And I'm guessing the U.S. backing Taiwan didn't exactly help smooth things over.
Nope, not at all. The U.S. slapped trade embargoes on China, basically shutting down most economic interactions. The Cold War was in full swing, and these two, they were on opposite sides of the fence.
From wartime allies back to basically square one. Wild how quickly things can change. But hold on, what about Nixon? He goes to China in '72. That's got to be a huge deal, right? A turning point.
Oh, massive turning point. A total thaw in relations. Both sides realized they needed to find a way to, well, be more practical, you know?
I mean, it makes sense. The U.S. wanted to counter the Soviets, and China was itching to modernize its economy, get back on the world stage.
Exactly. So they signed this thing called the Shanghai Communique. It's basically a roadmap to better relations, putting the emphasis on peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, all that.
And what about the trade side of things? Did that open the floodgates again?
It was definitely a huge step in that direction. By 1979, the U.S. officially recognizes the People's Republic of China, a complete 180 from just a few decades earlier. And that paved the way for a whole lot of trade and investment that would change everything for both countries and the whole global economy.
It's crazy, right? We started with ginseng on a ship and ended up talking global power plays. I love it.
And we're just getting started. The story of U.S.-China trade is full of surprises, and believe me, the next chapter is a real nail-biter.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We just finished talking about the early days of U.S.-China trade. From that very first ship, the Empress of China, all the way up to Nixon's trip to China.
Right, a lot of back and forth.
Seriously.
Ooh.
Okay, so now we're getting into the modern era and things are about to get even more interesting.
Buckle up. The late 1970s was a major turning point, not just for U.S.-China relations, but for China itself.
This is when Deng Xiaoping comes in, right?
Exactly.
The architect of modern China, as they call him. One of our sources mentions his famous quote, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice."
Pragmatism at its finest.
Right. It seems like he really prioritized economic growth, maybe even over ideology.
Absolutely. And that had huge implications for trade with the U.S.
Okay, so break it down for us. How did his reforms change the game?
Well, Deng's strategy was basically to open China up to the world.
Okay, so how did he actually do that?
Well, he encouraged foreign investment, for one.
You are?
He set up these special economic zones with like crazy tax breaks.
Oh, wow.
And he started to shift away from that centrally planned economy, towards something a little more market-driven.
So China basically said, hey, world, come on in, set up shop, do business.
Exactly. And American companies, they were lining up to get a piece of that.
Makes sense. China's a massive market, huge potential for growth, and let's be honest, those liver production costs must have been pretty tempting too.
Oh, absolutely. It was a chance to tap into this massive consumer market that was just exploding. Plus, cheaper labor, cheaper everything. Manufacturing just boomed. China became the world's factory. You know what I mean?
Yeah, making everything. Clothes, electronics, cars, you name it. So it sounds like a win-win, at least on the surface. American consumers got cheaper goods. China's economy took off. Everyone's happy, right?
Well, not so fast. Our sources point out that all this economic interdependence, it started to create some underlying tensions.
Okay, so what were the issues? What were people worried about?
Well, one big concern was this growing U.S. trade deficit with China.
Ah, the trade deficit.
Yeah.
We hear that term thrown around a lot, but for those of us who aren't economists, can you break that down?
Sure. Basically, a trade deficit means a country is importing more stuff than it's exporting. So in this case, the U.S. was buying way more from China than China was buying from the U.S.
Okay, that makes sense. But is some level of trade deficit normal?
Yeah, to some extent, especially in a globalized economy. But the size of the U.S.-China deficit, that's what started ringing alarm bells.
Got it. So, besides the numbers themselves, what were the worries? What did people think this would lead to?
The big fear was that it would hurt American manufacturing jobs. The argument was that China's lower wages, combined with, well, let's just say some questionable trade practices, were giving their companies a big advantage. And that, the fear was, would lead to American factories shutting down, people losing their jobs.
So this wasn't just about economics, it was about real people's livelihoods. And this tension, this anxiety, it eventually boils over.
Yep. Enter the trade war.
The Trump administration, tariffs flying back and forth, it felt like watching a ping pong match. What was the goal there?
Well, the Trump administration, they wanted to protect American industries, bring jobs back, and ultimately reduce that trade deficit.
And China fought back, right? Putting tariffs on American goods like soybeans and corn.
Oh, absolutely. It was a tit-for-tat escalation.
Each side trying to inflict as much economic pain as possible. Our sources talk about the impact of that trade war on global markets. What were some of the biggest consequences?
Well, in the short term, costs went up. Businesses and consumers on both sides felt it. American companies using Chinese components, their prices shot up, and those increases got passed along to consumers.
Ouch.
And of course, the same thing happened in China. Chinese businesses faced higher costs for American goods. Their consumers felt it too.
So it was lose-lose, at least in the short term. But what about the long term? Did the trade war actually achieve anything?
Good question. It's still being debated, honestly. There's no doubt it disrupted those global supply chains, made businesses nervous.
Definitely created a lot of uncertainty.
Big time. Some people argue that it did force China to make some concessions. And remember that Phase 1 trade deal in 2020?
Right. That's what's to calm things down.
Exactly. China agreed to buy more American goods, and some of the tariffs got rolled back.
But did that deal really fix the core problems?
Not really. Some immediate concerns, yeah, maybe. But those deeper structural issues, they never really went away. Plus, even with the tariffs being lowered, the damage was done. It sent a message,
What kind of message?
that things were changing, that the U.S.-China relationship was becoming more confrontational, and that, well, that has implications that we're still dealing with today.
So we've gone from this period of super fast economic integration to a full-blown trade war, and now, well, who knows what's next? It's clear that this relationship, it's not simple, it's constantly shifting. And as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I'm really interested to see how these recent changes have played out in specific industries.
Yeah, that's where it gets real. We're going to look at how this has all impacted real people, real businesses, and that's going to give us some clues about what the future might hold for U.S.-China trade.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground, right? From the very first days of U.S.-China trade to the craziness of the trade war. But now let's get down to brass tacks. Our sources pointed out a couple of key areas that have been hit hard by all this back and forth, agriculture and technology.
Yeah, those two have really been on the front lines.
So let's start with agriculture. American farmers, especially those growing soybeans and corn, they were super reliant on the Chinese market for a long time.
Oh, yeah. Huge export market for them.
But then the trade war happened, and China starts looking for other places to get its soybeans and corn. So what's the impact been for those farmers? What are they dealing with now?
It's been tough. For a lot of them, exports just plummeted, incomes took a nosedive. Some have had to, scale back, make some really difficult decisions.
Like going out of business.
Yeah, in some cases. And it's not just the farmers themselves. It ripples out, affects whole communities.
Rural economies really take a hit.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that trade policy, yeah, it's all about numbers and big picture stuff, but it has a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so agriculture is one side of the coin. What about the tech industry? How have they been weathering the storm?
Well, tech's got its own set of problems. The U.S. has put restrictions on exporting certain high-tech goods to China, things like semiconductors. That makes it harder for American companies to compete over there.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, China's been pouring money into its own tech sector, right? Trying to catch up, become less dependent on American technology.
Oh, absolutely. They've got their eye on the prize, investing heavily in research and development, aiming to be self-sufficient in all those key tech areas.
So now you've got American tech giants going head-to-head with this rising tech power. Must be pretty intense.
A whole new level of competition.
So it's like this high-stakes game, constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
Yeah.
And the stakes are huge, not just for these companies, but for the whole global economy.
No doubt about it. The decisions that the U.S. and China make in the next few years, they're going to shape everything. How they manage this relationship, finding that balance between working together and, well, let's be honest, competing with each other, that's going to determine the future of trade, technology, even global politics.
It's a lot to unpack. We've gone from ginseng on a ship to this incredibly intricate web of economic and political ties. And it's clear that the U.S.-China relationship is not going anywhere. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think it's important to remember that the future of this relationship, it's not set in stone. There are a lot of different ways this could play out, and the choices that leaders make, both in the U.S. and in China, they're going to determine the outcome. It's a relationship that requires careful attention, understanding the nuances, being willing to adapt as things change. It's not easy.
Well said. That's what we've tried to do in this deep dive, explore the history, the challenges, the opportunities of U.S.-China trade. It's a relationship that's going to continue to define the 21st century. So to our listeners, keep digging into this topic, read those sources, and come to your own conclusions about what the future holds for this complex and honestly fascinating relationship. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring.